Well, hey, what's up, buddy?
How's it going?
Pretty good. How you doing?
Okay. All right, so I'm muting the stream, and I'm not going to watch the comments, but you can feel free to relay them to me.
Okay. Are you that intimidated by chat?
I am easily distracted.
Oh, okay.
And, yeah, intimidated by life in general. It's okay.
Gotcha.
So I'll talk a little bit about, myself and why I initially sent you an email, and then we can get started.
Yeah,
Is that,
sure.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay. So I listened to this conversation about race that you had with some idiot. I forget his name. And
The guy at the Daily Stormer, the big race realist guy, or a different person?
Various. You're right. There were a couple. And I
Okay.
listened to most of them, I think. And and it upset me. And a lot of the language that you used was a little bit imprecise, and so I wanted to send you, an email telling you a little bit more about, how people think about these things, and then you asked me if I was interested in talking. And normally scientists try to sort of stay out of the fray, and I thought about doing that, but these days with racists sort of in charge of policy and stuff, I just thought maybe it would be good to try something different. So my background is that I have a PhD in a STEM field, and I've done research for many years. I fairly recently, in the past few years, started doing genetics research, and I do research full time. I don't work for a company. I work for either a university or a medical institution. So what I had sort of had in mind for talking to you about today is to sort of address the idea of asking these questions along the lines of, maybe a racist person would ask, are differences between races real? And I wanted to explain some of the ways in which I thought that this was not a well-posed question. My personal research does not involve race or ethnicity at the moment, but these are things that we think about. And so, of course, if something comes up and it sounds really sketchy to you, then feel free to ask me questions. And actually, in general, I hope that you ask me questions because it's just good to make sure that there's clarity and that we both understand each other.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so just like a rundown of why I think that is not a well-posed question. The first is that...
The original question you're referring to is?
So, are differences between races real?
Okay, gotcha.
That's kind of the question that, racist people sort of want to know, right? And they want to be, affirmed that there is such a thing as race and that, I don't know, all this other stuff. So the first thing is that race itself is not a well-defined term. It's sort of whatever people define it to be. And I think you have a good grasp on that idea. And I agree with a lot of stuff that I've heard you say. The second is that whenever you create two groups of people, differences are going to exist. So it's sort of even a silly question.
It's almost tautological, right? By definition, right. Being in a different group means there are differences, sure.
Yeah. And the third is so what does real mean? Well, they're looking for something that's genetically causal, right? Mm-hmm. And for most complex traits, especially things involving social factors and intelligence and even a lot of diseases like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, you can just go down the list. There are tons and tons of things that are very hard to find genetically causal factors for. And then the last thing is that even if these things can be proved to have some sort of genetic cause, people I listened to this debate between you and this big internet streamer, and he was talking about how blacks in America have problems and Africans have problems too, and so there's got
JonTron,
JonTron, right?
It's got to be similarity there causally.
And so one of the things that I just wanted to point out is that Africa has greater genetic variation than the rest of the world combined. because people sort of started in Africa and then they went out. And so all of human diversity is sort of a subset of the diversity that exists in Africa.
Okay, since you're an educated person, I'm going to nitpick you a lot, okay? Ready?
Sure, yeah.
Couldn't you technically argue that unless you've actually done actual, like, genetic studies of breaking down, like, different genomes of different people, couldn't you technically argue that that may not necessarily be true? For instance, let's say that if we measured variation on a scale of 1 to 10 in Africa and all 10 degrees existed, couldn't you technically argue that maybe degrees 4 and 5 broke off, but as a result of them migrating to other parts of the planet, they expanded into 20 different degrees, while the African area still stayed degrees 1 through 10, and then that 4 to 5 expanded to a new, like, 1 to 20? Could you technically make that argument?
Yeah, so I get what you're asking. So part of it is that, okay, so one thing you could say is, like, well, in Africa, most people tend to have dark skin, and very few people have blue eyes, right? And there are blue-eyed people in Europe. So, like, what the hell? Obviously, there are some people who exist outside of Africa who have, features or phenotypes or whatever that don't exist in Africa. And there's some, aspects to their lives that are different from what happens in Africa. And that's true. But if you actually do a numerical statistical analysis, and I haven't done it myself, I'm just taking other people's words for it, and I can pass this on to you, and you can look up the sources. If you want me to look up references, I can do that too.
Sure.
But if you look at the variation of the genome, from one place to another, just on a mathematical level, what you find is that there's greater variation in Africa, and that the variation in the rest of the world is sort of a subset of that.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if it makes sense. So one of the ways that, we look at the genome is we sequence people, and we see, are there certain places where they have 1 copy of an allele, 2 copies of an allele, 0 copies of an allele, and then we turn that information into, like, a mathematical object, and then we try to manipulate that object. So the most recent genetic work that's being done is all very highly mathematical. So it's not like people are sort of looking at different phenotypes and trying to see, like, exactly, like, is there a variation of, like, hair color and this and that, like arm length or like toenail size? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the overall genetic diversity of the different populations of the world.
Sure. Alleles that may or may not necessarily manifest in different types of phenotypes, right?
Right. They may or may not.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I just talked a bunch, and I was wondering if there's anything in particular that you were interested in discussing or hearing about from me as well. I'm going to go into these things in depth in a minute, but
No, I mean, I don't. I mean, like,
Okay.
I wish I haven't had like any debates recently. Like, I feel like I have a decent understanding of this. I guess I just need more of like the types of questions I get when I talk to these types of people. But yeah, go ahead into greater depth.
Yeah. Okay. So what's race? You have a good grasp of that. Race is sort of like some division between different groups of people that another group of people sort of just made up.
So somebody else emailed me and they told me that this was the explanation given to me that kind of made me look at this a little bit differently. Was when scientists classify things, you typically do it in a way that makes sense. It's something to give you some sort of predictive power, some sort of information about a particular group of things. You wouldn't create group A and then arbitrarily bundle people together into it, because there's no point then in having a group A. And what he said was that race is essentially an arbitrary set of phenotypes that isn't really used scientifically because there's just no reason to do it. Scientists don't treat humans as black people and white people and Chinese, but because there's just not very much scientific use in grouping people together in racial ways that we do socially, is essentially what he said, which is why scientists don't recognize it as a like a strong concept unless you're doing work. And then I think you said specifically related to like sociology, where you're referencing the boxes that people actually check, like on the surveys.
Yeah, so you brought up a number of good points, and I'm going to get back to them in a minute.
Okay.
One thing that I just wanted to say is that, race is not defined by scientists, and scientists, I don't think, would ever try to define race. First of all, because that word is it has terrible connotations. And secondly, just because
there's not much use.
Yeah. So I actually want to disagree with what you said. Scientists do sometimes use race, and we use it in two different ways. One, I see it used occasionally as a proxy for social, geographic, and environmental effects in general. So I can give you an example. Typically, if you go to the hospital because you're sick, they make you fill out some forms. And one of the things that they'll make you do or ask you to do, you don't have to do it, I guess, is you check off a box that specifies your race. And so when scientists analyze medical data, this is one of the pieces of information that scientists sometimes have. And that can be informative, especially if there's not a lot of other information about people. So one of the things I did was
Wait, can you expand on that? I'm curious. When you say that can be informative in what ways?
Well, let's say you have a bunch of medical information about people, and you don't know where they live, you don't know how much money they make, you don't know how they grew up, you don't know a million other social environmental factors about their lives, right? Sometimes when doing a statistical study, you can throw in race as sort of like, and by race I mean the checkbox that people filled out on their hospital admissions form.
Okay. You
can throw that in as a proxy for some of those things. So I can give you an example.
Sure.
I think you live in Omaha, right?
Yes, you doxed.
So I doxed you. I'm sorry. I did a little bit of looking around, and I saw that there's a part of Omaha, I think it's like the south central Omaha, where there are a lot of
Mexicans.
Hold on a second. Yeah, there are a lot of Mexicans.
South O is Mexican, North O is black people, and then west onwards is whiter and whiter, pretty much.
Yeah, and I looked at a map of educational attainment, which has been making the rounds, and educational attainment in the southern part of Omaha is lower than other parts.
Sure.
So you can imagine you go to a hospital and they don't ask you like what your educational attainment was, but they do ask you, your race, and they do measure like other quantities, other phenotypical things about you. Somebody who put down Hispanic or Mexican on that form, that would sort of group. Knowing that person is Mexican, you might be able to make assumptions about where they live and what their educational attainment is, and that would sort of take those confounders out of the problem. So if you know that the person is Mexican, they most likely live to the south of the city, where maybe the air quality is different, maybe the soil's a little bit different, maybe they have to drive a little bit more or a little bit less to get downtown. I don't know if there is a downtown in Omaha. I assume so.
There is. Fuck
okay,
off.
Right. And so, so if you include race as a covariate, then you can get some of that information, and that can be useful or not. And sometimes it depends what you're looking for. Another time where you can use...
If someone in chat says something, I just want to clarify so people don't think you're an idiot. So somebody in chat said, I think this guy is stretching how useful that information actually is. So I think when you mention that you can gather that information as a proxy, it's more just like, it's kind of like putting together a larger picture for you, but you're not literally going to like determine a life-saving cancer treatment based on the fact that they checked off Mexican on the box or something, right? It's just like another kind of piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely not. And... if you have, let's say you have a study, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't explain it very well, and there's more to it. Let's say you have a study where you have lots of medical information, but you have no other information. You have nothing about like where they live. You have nothing about, who they are, how they grew up. Then this is at least like one little piece of the puzzle that might be informative about those kinds of things. And so it could give you a little bit more power to predict, important... or whatever it is you're trying to predict.
Sure.
It's just, one more piece of the puzzle that can help. And it's not that, like, we're identifying what their race is. and we're not defining race at all for them. It's that, they are given a box that they're asked to check off by a hospital, and we're using that self-identification maybe to try to improve a model or to try to get a better understanding of what is environmental and what is genetic.
Sure.
I could be overstating how useful this is. I'm not saying it is useful. It depends on the study, and it depends on the details and context. Another thing that excuse me, give me a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Another time when people, like geneticists, will sometimes use the word race is if they're comparing like two totally different groups of people with similar genetics. I've seen it used in that context. So, for example, if you wanted to study Cubans in the U.S. And see how environmental factors affected their lives differently from like Haitians who live in Haiti, then I've seen that used as race in scientific papers. And I don't really, like that term very much for those things, but you can sort of spice up a paper a little bit. And so I've seen it happen before. And again, in that case, it's used as a proxy for environmental effects and other things.
Sure.
Okay. So race, I think, is not something that's totally real. It's something that, people have defined. But there is something that is kind of real, and that's ancestry, which is basically where your ancestors lived. And so you can imagine that, like, you sequence somebody's DNA, and from the DNA sequence, you can predict with some probability that their ancestors lived in certain places. So, if you sequence someone's genome and they're mostly European, you might see that they're 30% like Italian, 40% German, and so on and so on. If you were able to get a hold of their ancestors' documents and see exactly where their ancestors lived, you could theoretically test that, right? You could say, well, this ancestor lived in Italy, and this ancestor lived in Germany, and this ancestor lived in France, and so this is 9 out of 18 or whatever, whatever.
Sure.
And of course you could be wrong. Like, you might have Italian ancestry, and it turns out that your ancestor 1,000 years ago didn't live in Italy. He lived in France, and his dad lived in Italy. And so you could say, well, you say I have Italian ancestry, but, this guy, he lived in France. He didn't live in Italy. And, I would say, well, okay, you're right. I'm wrong. And there's a certain probability that I'm going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. So ancestry is kind of a real thing, and you can use it to make, okay, sorry. One more thing I wanted to say was that if you look at a map of the world today, we have a better understanding of where people are living now than where they lived, 1,000 years ago. So people who are living in Italy today may have been living in another place back then. So I wanted to get to an example. So if you, Stephen, were to take one of these tests from Ancestry.com or 23andMe, you've said before that you're part Cuban, right?
Yeah, 50%, yeah.
Okay, 50% Cuban. And then your other parent is of European descent? Is that right?
Yeah, some random European shit, yeah. Okay,
so there are a bunch of European countries from that place. And so the question is, like, what would you see if you got back your results from 23andMe? Would it say that you were Cuban? And the answer is no, actually. It would say that you are some mixture of people who migrated to Cuba and who originally lived in Cuba, hundreds of years ago. So there's some mixture of Native American, African, and European. And I have a paper. Yeah, so you can look at this article, which talks about a bunch of stuff. And if you scroll down to the picture, there are like it says Cuba, and there's some red, and there's some green, and there's some purple. And you can see that, when you sequence people's genomes, you can determine how much European, how much African, and how much Native American make up each of these different people. And so I wanted to point this out just to say that, ancestry is something that's real and it's measurable. And that's different from race. Race is something that, people sort of make up. And ancestry is something that, is sort of something that we can predict.
Gotcha.
We talk about...
To clarify on that point, ancestry essentially tells you where somebody came from, but you're not getting much more predictiveness in any other way out of that rather than that, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's predictive in the sense that you can predict where their ancestors came from with some
gotcha.
probability.
Clarifying that because somebody could use what you just said to go, okay, well, if I know somebody's from Africa, then I know they're stupid, even if they don't necessarily look that way, as long as I know the ancestry, right?
I didn't even think that somebody might have thought that.
I've talked to enough people to be thinking of all of it.
Right. But Good. I'm glad that you were here. Yeah. This population structure, the differences between these groups is not necessarily caused by selection. There's something called genetic drift, which is just sort of the random, it's changes in the genetic sequence, genetic code, due to random chance. And I wanted to give an example, but maybe that's not a good idea. So you can imagine...
What do you mean it's not a good idea?
No, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking out loud.
Oh, okay.
So you can imagine if there's a small population of people, and one person randomly develops a mutation. There's some random chance that through breeding over the years, some of their children will have that mutation and it'll get passed on to other people. And just by random chance, that mutation can become dominant in the population, and then it can become sort of the thing that everybody in the population has. And once a mutation is everywhere, then there's no way for it to go away. Does that make sense? I didn't explain it very well.
I think so. Let me try this. When we think of evolution, ordinarily, we think of natural selection occurring where there is pressure from the environment that selects for specific traits that give advantages to certain species, to certain people that allow that trait to reproduce genetically, right, and spread throughout civilization. But with genetic drift, you're saying that just by random chance, there may be a genetic trait that isn't necessarily selected for that just happens to spread through a given population for no real reason. There wasn't an evolutionary advantage or any kind of selective pressure that chose that trait. It just kind of happened to spread, right?
Yeah, or to slightly rephrase, if there were no reason why a trait might spread, it might spread anyway just due to random chance.
Sure, okay.
Okay, it's the same thing, but just worded slightly differently.
Sure, that's
yeah. And another thing that I think is interesting and sort of nice to know is that, I sent you this other link a while ago. Let me find that. There's a paper that I really like. It was in my original email. Sorry.
Hold on. Just wanted to say something real fast. Someone in chat said, Destiny, that sounds more like a mutation. All genetic change or whatever, all evolution is based on mutation. But the difference between, if I understand what he's saying correctly, the difference between what we would consider like evolution and genetic drift is that evolution is when a random mutation happens that gives you a benefit in the environment that allows you to out-reproduce other genes. And genetic drift is just when a random mutation happens that isn't necessarily beneficial or detrimental, and it just happens to spread without there being a natural selection applied to that trait. Right?
Yeah,
so both are a mutation.
If a mutation happens, it's possible for that mutation to spread because of natural selection, but it's also possible for it to spread just due to random chance.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, 1 second. Sorry. I don't know how to do this. Okay, so there's a paper called Genes Mirror Geography Within Europe. And what it shows is that if you take a look at the genomes of lots of people in Europe and you make a plot of the principal components of their genomes. I'll say what that is in a minute. And you graph the genomes on this plot, then what you get is something that looks a lot like a map of Europe. Okay, so what are the principal components? So the principal components are the directions of greatest variation in the genome. So the genome has 3 billion base pairs. You have 0, 1, or 2 copies of an allele at each of those locations. And you can imagine making a graph that's 3 billion dimensional and picking the direction of greatest variation among all those genes. So it's some sort of like superposition of all the different genes. And if you take the direction that has the most variation and the second most variation, and you plot all of the people's genomes in Europe on this graph, then you find something that looks a lot like the map of Europe. And so the largest directions of genetic variation in Europe are just north, south, east, and west. Okay, so did that kind of make sense?
Let me see if I can break this down in RPG terms. You tell me if this is right. So
Okay.
Let's say that we have 7 different stats, like strength, luck, dexterity, agility, whatever, right? Or we've got 7 different stats, right?
Yeah.
If we take somebody who has, maybe their 2 highest stats are strength and agility, and those are like by far like their 2 highest stats. If we find every other person with strength and agility who's also high, and then we map those out, you would find that if you do that with every very strong trait, whichever one is like the highest on every person or whatever, that you could make a map of people that would be geographically relevant, or no?
No, it's not really that.
Okay.
So you were talking about looking for things that are like the highest and the best, and I'm talking about looking for variation. So how things that change the most. So you can imagine, like, what if in all of your genome, what if everything was affected significantly by whether or not you lived on a mountain or you lived near a river, and everybody who lived on a mountain had some sort of, genetic thing that made them distinct from the people who lived in the river. And let's say that this was like very clear, and this was the biggest difference between people on Earth, that it's whether you live on a mountain or you live in a river. Then the 2 biggest components, the biggest differences between people would map to like mountains and rivers in Europe, right? So if you look along the components of the directions of greatest variation, you would have people separated into whether or not they live on a mountain or if they live in a river. And what I'm saying here is that geography is the thing that drives the principal components of the genetic variation. And so the differences between people on a genetic level, if they exist, the biggest differences are just sort of where they live. And so it's this sort of like, it's the way that people in neighboring regions interact with each other, and the selective pressures that you might think exist because of terrain or geography, those are unimportant in comparison with just where they are.
So you're saying terrain and geography don't impact those outstanding variables, or?
So I'm saying that the thing that has the biggest impact on genetic variation in Europe is north, south, east, west. And things like if you live in the mountains, if you live in a river, those things are less important.
What things are less important?
Okay, well, let's move on. I'm not explaining it very well.
Sorry.
Sorry. No, it's very technical, and maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. I'm sorry about that.
Sure.
Yeah. So okay. Okay. So let me try it one more time. If the biggest differences between people were that they lived on a mountain or they lived in a river, then on this plot you would have people segregate by whether they lived in a mountain or whether they lived near a river. But you don't have that kind of thing. It just mirrors the map of Europe. And so the fact that it basically mirrors the map of Europe means that the thing that drives differences between people is simply who they interact with.
Okay, hold on. I'm sorry. So, like, let me. I think I just clicked. I had an Athene moment. So what you're saying is, let's say that we have mountain people to the north, and we've got mountain people to the south, and mountain people to the southwest, right? You would, you might expect that, like, all of these people have similar DNA because they're all from mountains, but in reality, what you find is that the northerner DNA matches northern people, southern people match southern people, western people match western people, and it really doesn't have much to do with topography or geography. Is that what you're saying? That the most predictive thing is just where they're from, not geography in the sense of topography, but geography in the sense of, like, location, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I understand. Because my next question was going to be, what you're saying there is kind of telling then of key genetic differences that could contribute to environments making better people, but what you're essentially saying is the environment doesn't seem to have that large of an impact. It's more just where you're from being different, right?
Yeah, it's just like the diffusion of genes across different populations.
Gotcha, I understand. And not the hardcore selection of genes that can be radically determined based on your particular topography.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I understand.
Okay, cool.
I've read, like, some random things just from arguments in the past that seems consistent with there was a study, a PubMed thing that was focused on or published on Kenyans, because a lot of people wanted to know if like, are Kenyans, because of the Usain Bolt and everything, are they, like, genetically determined to be, like, god runners or whatever? And it seemed like
Usain Bolt's Jamaican. Okay, go on.
Or what? It's all the same. They're all black people.
I know. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I fucking
Kenyans are distance runners.
Yeah. My bad. But the report essentially said that there were a ton of different confounding factors, most of them seeming to do with culture and environmental things in terms of why, I guess, Usain Bolt's people. I'm not sure now if it was Kenyans or if it was Jamaicans. I'm pretty sure it was Kenyans, for why they were such good runners.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. So whatever, if there are selective pressures on people, just in general, those selective pressures are going to be very difficult to find.
Sure. Can I ask a question, just because I should know this, but so when did people all start you said we migrated off of Africa. When did that happen? How many years ago?
I don't know. I don't know.
Was this stuff that happened before the Homo sapien, or was this, like...
No, after.
It was after? So does that put it within the past 13,000 years, or?
Well, okay, after and before, right? Because there were, like, Neanderthals who went into Europe, and there were...
but then the...
other groups of people who went to other places. But Homo sapiens...
Didn't the Neanderthal go first, and then, like, Homo sapiens went and, like, wrecked all their shit?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Although we're part Neanderthal, so it's unclear how much we wrecked their shit and how much they wrecked ours.
Really? I thought it was majority. I thought that it was, like, it seemed like the Neanderthals pretty much got all their shit pushed in and were, like, majorly fucked. I could be wrong on that, but okay, sorry, that's not relevant, but okay.
No, we're only, like, 2% Neanderthal or 4% or something like that. But it still lives on, so
gotcha.
It's nice to think about those things. Sure. Yeah. So one thing that I said that the diversity in Africa is greater than the rest of the world. One of the places where diversity is lowest is in the Americas. So if you go to, like, ancestry.com thing and you fill out you have Native American ancestry, it'll be much more difficult for them to determine where in the Americas your ancestors came from than, like, let's say, where in Africa or where in Europe they came from, because people came to the Americas much more recently, and populations haven't had as much time to diverge.
Sure.
So how hard is it to prove that something is actually genetically causal? Right now it's really hard, and we're really bad at it. Up until maybe a few years ago, the standard technique, and this is still standard, is something called a GWAS study, GWAS, which stands for Genome-Wide Association Study. The way this works is you get, like, hopefully several thousand people, and you sequence their genome. We don't usually sequence the whole genome. We usually sequence a fraction of it because it costs money, and because there are lots of places in the genome where there's just very little variation. That just tends to be less informative. And actually, something that's interesting that I never knew until I started doing genetics research is that there are places in the genome that are called ultra-conserved regions that are not just conserved among people, but among species as well. And so people and rats and mice and lizards might all have these regions of the genome in common, small phrases or large phrases even that are the same from species to species. And we expect that those things are kind of important. If it's stayed the same for millions of years, then probably it's required for life to exist, because mutations happen a lot, especially over, hundreds of millions of years. And so, yeah.
You're saying that these are genetic sequences that are found among all living things?
Not necessarily all living things, because stuff like viruses are arguably alive.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, like all
bacteria, but certainly all mammals, all vertebrates.
Gotcha.
Yeah, sure. You can pick a subgroup, and there's going to be, yeah. So GWAS studies tend to focus on places in the genome where where we are likely to see some variation. And so what you do is you have 3 billion base pairs, you study maybe a few thousand people, and you're trying to look for places in the genome where you appear to have some effect on the phenotype. So let's say you're studying height. You might find a place, maybe it's the 5,000th nucleotide on the 4th chromosome. Excuse me. You're looking at it and you see, in some people it's an A, and in some people it's a C. And in the people where it's an A who have in people where they have an A and they have 2 copies of the allele, maybe they're 2 inches shorter than people who have 1 copy of an A, and maybe they're 1 inch shorter than people who have no copies of the A, and they're all C or whatever. And so if you find that there's a strong correlation between having a certain allele or not, and the phenotype that you're trying to measure, then you might say that this is a significant hit. One of the problems with this study is that you're likely to get things just by random chance. And it's not a problem. So if you're trying to look for something that's significant across the whole genome, because if you study the genome, you've got like 3 billion base pairs. If there's something that's statistical and you say like, oh, the odds of that happening by random chance, that's 1 in a million. And so, oh yeah, I think this is for sure a real thing. But if you look at 3 billion base pairs, 1 in a million happens 3,000 times. So you need a very high level of statistical significance to make sure that you're not just getting, those 3,000 1 in a million things that occur. Sure. You need it to be like, 1 in a billion or more, or something like that.
Sure.
And so, we can study thousands of people. We can't study billions of people because that's the number of people that exist on Earth, right? Sure. So our statistics are somewhat limited. So we can do these GWAS studies, and a lot of the time we just get no significant hits. I don't study intelligence, and I don't know anybody who does, but I looked at some of the data that I could find online. Mm-hmm. One thing that I did is I went to snppedia.com, SNPedia, mm-hmm. and they have a lot of references on there about different types of phenotypes, and they have scientific studies, and they'll tell you what kinds of things, you can put in intelligence, and it'll give you some studies, and it'll give you some SNPs that are relevant to the thing that you're looking for.
Sure.
Did I define SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism?
Yeah, you did. Well, you did in the email to me, but not here.
Okay. So a SNP, SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, is just another name for a nucleotide. So if you have like ACTG, and sometimes it's a C and sometimes it's an A, then you would call that a SNP. Okay. So Yeah, so if you go to intelligence in SNPpedia, they say that there are no, what does it say? There are very few studies that have shown any significant GWAS hits. There is one study that found a few hits for educational attainment, and these hits accounted for 0.43% of the variation in educational attainment. So that's like 4 in 1,000 of the amount of variation, which is a very small amount.
Sure.
And these kinds of things are typical. So if you're on this page, if you click on the SNP, okay, hold on a second. Let me give you the thing in Skype. So this is, for example, the SNPpedia page, and then you can click on one of the SNPs, like this one. It'll tell you, like, okay, where is the allele, which chromosome? It'll tell you, like, how important it is. This one in particular doesn't have much information about it, but it does tell you the allele frequencies in different populations. So on the bottom of the page, there's something that says CEU, which is like Northern Europeans living in the U.S. And there's some frequency. It's like 23% have AA, like 30% have AC, and then the rest have CC, something like that. And then there's another group below it that, Yorubans in Africa who have slightly different allele frequencies. And so if you were trying to find differences in ancestry, different genetic differences based on ancestry, you might do this kind of thing. You would look for, you do a GWAS study for a single group of people, and then you do a GWAS study for another group of people, and you would compare whether or not the allele frequencies were the same, whether or not the same alleles were causal for the same phenotypes across different groups, and then maybe you'd be able to say something about, whether something was more common in one group or another. Stuff like intelligence, education, depression, most complex traits are very hard to find GWAS hits for, and maybe GWAS isn't even the best way to do things. Maybe you need like some sort of there are other things that have been done that are a little bit more what's the word? Give us a little bit better predictive power.
Sure.
But even if you did this, you wouldn't be able to say that Yorubans in Africa are representative of Africa, because the variation in Africa is greater than any other place on Earth. Africa is a huge place, but still the variation there is greater than any other place on Earth. So you can't just pick like one group of people and say that that's representative of Africa. The same way that you can't pick one group of people anywhere else and say it's representative anywhere else. Right? Yeah. So I also wanted to mention that I think IQ in general is a flawed measurement, and it's based on social factors, and I don't really believe in it too much. I think that one of the mistakes that people make when discussing these kinds of things is they say, okay, well, it's been shown, let's say, that IQ has a high heritability, which means, if your parents have an IQ of such and such, then the odds are good that the children will have an IQ within a certain range. Yeah. And the heritability tells you how wide that range is and how likely it is for something like that to happen. Just because something is highly heritable doesn't mean that a different exists across different groups, right? Because the last part of so there's some fraction that's heritability, and there's some fraction that's environmental effects. And if environmental effects are consistently different between the two groups, then of course you're going to have differences in phenotype, even if there is no difference in the genetics. And so teasing apart genetics from the environment is just very difficult to do, and almost impossible for things that are so complicated like this.
Sure. Are you familiar with the book The Bell Curve?
I haven't read it, but I've heard about it.
Gotcha. So do you have any strong opinions, or have you heard any strong academic opinions about it?
I mean, I think the whole point of the criticism of the bell curve is, and again, I just want to say, like, I'm not talking for the people that I work with. I'm talking about my own opinions, and like, I don't study the bell curve academically. But my understanding is that the whole problem with it is that they can't separate genes from the environment. And so if you try to say that some group of people scores worse on IQ tests than another group of people, that's just based on what they look like and what you think they are. And it has nothing, he's not studying the genetics. He doesn't know if one group of people is poorer than the other, and if one group of people has been systematically oppressed for hundreds of years. So I'm not really sure exactly what those kinds of things tell us, because it's based on so many different factors that aren't necessarily important in our lives.
Gotcha.
I can't give you too much more ammunition than that. I'm sorry.
Okay, I was just kind of curious.
Yeah. I have one more slightly funny story, and then that's all I really have for you. So I was dating this girl, and I got an ancestry kit for myself, and I got one for her, and we looked at the results for each other, and I analyzed the data because I'm the geneticist, and they can give you the raw data for Ancestry and for 23andMe, and so you can try to look for things on your own. And we were looking at things, and she goes, "Well, how about Asperger's?" And I was like, "Oh, you don't have Asperger's." I looked, and she was like, "No, I mean you." And I was like, "What do you mean me? You think I have Asperger's?" And she goes, "No, but my friend who met you thinks that you do." So I laughed, and I was like, "Oh, I'm sure I don't have Asperger's." And I looked it up, and sure enough, there's a SNP for Asperger's that makes it more likely that you have it if you have that SNP. And I had 2 copies of the rare allele, the one that happens very rarely in the population. And so this bothered me for 24 hours because I thought oh, maybe I do have Asperger's. And I thought about all the times when I was a kid and all the times, in my life where maybe I've been socially inept, and I thought maybe there's a reason for it. Turns out that the rare allele is protective of Asperger's. So there's a common allele that shows up in 78% of people from Finland. And for people who have Asperger's, it's actually 98%. So it's very difficult to interpret genetic data. And the majority of people have this allele that is like a risk factor for autism, for Asperger's, but that doesn't mean that they're actually likely to have Asperger's, right? So yeah.
Isn't Asperger's technically not a thing anymore?
Okay, I don't know. All I know is what the paper said.
Gotcha. Okay.
So people diagnosed as having Asperger's.
How long ago was this? I'm just curious.
I can find the paper for you.
Okay. I thought, I don't know if it was with the DSM-5. I thought they don't recognize Asperger's as its own thing anymore. It's just part of ASD.
I don't know. I am not an expert on this kind of thing. Sorry, give me a second.
Oh no, it might still be its own individual thing. No, never mind.
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my... I don't have it handy right now, but I can find it for you. You give me a little while, I will find it.
Yeah, no, it's no problem.
Syndrome. Oh, okay, here it is. Was this the study? Yeah. So it was 2007, 2008. Yeah. So it's a while ago. One of the problems that we have is that because of the genetic differences between people of different ancestries, people often try to do studies on very specific groups of people. So you might do a whole study on autism or Asperger's or whatever on Finns in Finland or people in Iceland or people with as little genetic diversity as possible, because then you have fewer confounding effects in the genetic data. And so as a result, a lot of studies have been done on Northern Europeans, and fewer studies have been done on other populations. And I think that's a problem that we have with the field, because it means that we generally know more about the diseases that affect Northern Europeans and less about diseases that affect other people and, what causes them, things like that.
Sure.
Okay. That's, I think I said a lot, and I hope some of that was useful for you, or at least interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
That's all I wanted to say.
Do you want to take questions from chat? I don't know if anybody in chat has any specific questions about anything.
I'm happy to take questions if they have some. But can you relay them to me, because I don't want to have to sort through that stuff myself.
Sure thing. All right. Does anybody have questions for our genetics buddy? Any real questions?
See, I'm glad I didn't. It's okay. You've got my email, and I don't check it all the time, but I check it occasionally. And if you have more questions or you want to talk about stuff, you can feel free to shoot me an email.
Someone says, "What about twin studies? What does that mean?"
Yeah, so twin studies are used to. Okay, so if you want to determine if something is highly heritable, the best way to do it is to look at two people who have the exact same genes and grew up in different environments. And so twin studies are done to determine the heritability of different phenotypes. So you can look at a pair of twins living in different places, and lots of pairs of twins, and see how they do over the course of their lives. I don't know exactly what the question is asking. But
yeah, that's what I was asking. I was like, what does it mean by that?
So that is. Twin studies are one of the best ways to determine whether something is heritable, but they're still not good ways to determine exactly what causes stuff. So there's this problem of missing heritability. You might be able to determine from twin studies that the heritability of some disease or some phenotype is, 30%. But then when we go through the genome, we don't find enough genetic variation to explain the 30%. Or if we find the genetic variation, we may not have enough, GWAS hits to explain all of the variation. And so there are a number of problems here, just sort of the field in general faces. One of the problems is that most diseases aren't caused by a single allele. There's some that are. Huntington's, I think, is caused by a single allele. Some types of, what's it called, where you don't have clotting in your blood? Hemophilia. Some types of hemophilia are caused by a single mutation in a single allele. And there are a few other diseases like that. But most diseases are caused, and most phenotypes are caused by a large number of different SNPs. And they may not all be very large effect sizes. It may be the sum of a very large number of small effect sizes. Or it could be...
He typed later, he said in regards to IQ. Do you know of any twin studies that have been conducted that speak to IQ differences?
So twin studies have determined the heritability of IQ. But again, like...
so you kind of spoke to this earlier, so maybe to focus on this answer, I've heard people say plenty of times that IQ is 75% heritable, and when they say that, what they mean is that 75% of your intelligence comes from IQ. Does that make sense what I mean when I say it that way?
Something like that, I think.
So like,
say it again.
If they think that when they read the heritability of IQ is 75%, they think that like differences, like you could explain up to 75% of the differences in IQ from heritability, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 75% of the variation of the IQ could be explained by heritability. Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if that number is accurate or not, but that's what it would mean.
Yeah.
So I have this other paper. It's called Intelligence, New Findings and Theoretical Developments. The first author is Richard Nesbitt, and it's from what year? 2012. Oh shit! I hit the back thing instead of hitting the thing. And what they say is that when the importance of the environment for IQ is established by the 12-point to 18-point increase in IQ when children are adopted from working class to middle class homes.
Wait, they say what? Say that. Could you say that again?
Yeah, the importance of the environment for IQ. Here, let me just give you the link so you can look at it later too. Okay, point E in the abstract is that the importance of the environment for IQ is established by the 12-point to 18-point increase in IQ when children are adopted from middle class to working class homes. So, to paraphrase, when kids from working class homes are adopted to middle class homes, their IQ magically appears to rise by 12 to 18 points. And that's because
that's a really big thing,
effects.
Because I've heard a lot of people. Is this like a credible study or whatever?
As far as I know, let me see. APA.
Do you know this
American
is published?
Psychiatric Association. Yeah, so it's been published.
Because I hear what you just said. I've heard that that's not true. Somebody commonly cited, or one common thing that race realists cite is the study of black kids adopted to white families and then claiming that there was no change in intelligence even when they were adopted or something. I hear that a lot, and I haven't gotten around to looking at the article. I looked it up on Wikipedia, but even in that article, it was saying that there was actually some change in intelligence. I'm confused why people cite it, but
I absolutely have no background in this field. If you look up the journal articles and you send them to me, then I can help you go through them and try to understand them.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I have no personal knowledge of the ongoing controversy around this. And, I gotta think that people are gonna believe what they want to believe if they're lay people, right? It's just one of these things where like these crazy race realists will find what they want to find. And I don't know what the truth is. I don't know. Sorry, I should not say that. Yeah. Sorry, I was saying something else kind of technical, and I just wanted to add one more thing, which is that sometimes lots of small effects can add up to a big effect. Sometimes there aren't that many small effects, but there are lots of very rare big effects. So you could imagine that there's a group of like 1,000 people that you're studying, and one person in that group of 1,000 people has a mutation that causes a huge effect on that person. And each of those 1,000 people who are in the case group, all of these 1,000 people who have, ostensibly the same disease, they could all have a different mutation. They could all be the only person in that group that has a mutation, but somehow down the pipeline it leads to the same effect somewhere else. And that's another thing that's really confounding us these days, and we're trying to get a hold on.
Gotcha. Here's the abstract to that twins thing.
Compared mean IQ test. Okay, fine. I don't have a background in this field, so I don't know what other studies exist. It looks like this was done in 1986. So that was 30 years ago.
Sure.
And then I also see something about a database record in 2016. No, it's 1986, so it's 30 years ago. So God knows what's changed since then. I have no idea. Let me click on the link. Okay. Oh, I don't have access at home.
Oh, this doesn't look like this is speaking to anything genetically. Well, the abstract of this actually goes as far as to even say it, which were conceptualized as culturally determined. White adopted mothers tended to release tension by joking, grinning, and laughing, while black adopted mothers more often release tension in less positive ways, such as scowling, coughing, and frowning. I learned this from the Chappelle Show.
Yeah, so this is the kind of thing that's like not at all my thing of expertise, because it's not quantitative, right? You're trying to ascribe, like, I mean, I guess IQ is quantitative, but there are all sorts of different factors when you're trying to put people in different homes and measure their IQ. It's like, it's just not a good way to measure things.
This can't possibly be the study that the race realist cite, guys, right? This abstract seems to go against everything they say. It is concluded that the ethnicity of the rearing environments exerts a significant
influence on children's styles responding to standardized tests and on their test of achievements.
White adopted mothers are more like, yeah, I'm not sure. Because this goes on to explore it like through behaviors and whatnot. So 23 black children were adopted by middle-class white families, and then 23 age-matched black children had been adopted by middle-class black families. And the 23 adopted by the white families showed IQs that were a standard deviation, showed nearly one standard deviation above, which would point to the fact that the IQs of the children were being largely influenced by their environment and not necessarily their race, right? It's not the study that race realists cite, but it's one that would help debunk what they say. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Oh, okay, never mind. I'll try to find that other one sometime, then I'll shoot it your way.
Okay.
I think...
Yeah, and just to reiterate, even if they think that this is a real thing, there are really no studies that can point to a single nucleotide in your genome and say this thing is responsible for intelligence, even a little bit. It's just, yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
What is your, so what are you currently researching now? What exactly?
I don't want to tell you. I'm sorry.
You don't want to tell me? Oh, you think it's too personal or whatever?
Yeah, I don't want to reveal too much about
what
I'm working on.
Okay.
We're just trying to come up with better ways to understand how genes affect people's health. That's sort of what our whole field is doing. Because this, like I said, we do these studies and we try to find what causes people to be unhealthy or what causes them to be, whatever. And we're finding out over the past, 5 or 10 years that there's just, it's not really the easiest way to do things. I mean, it's an easy way to do things. It's not a very informative way to do things.
Yeah, I remember reading something somewhat recently about a guy that was kind of lamenting that even like basic health stuff isn't really well understood. Things like drinking water and exercise is probably better for you, but like even things as simple as that are really hard to explain in a scientific, objective manner. Like, why is exercise actually better for your heart? Like, even a question as seemingly simple as that is like really hard to explain in a technical way.
Yeah. I haven't seen any studies about that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But I imagine that like just exercise is such a complex thing.
Yeah, it was in a thread that popped up where somebody had asked the question like, why is stress to your heart induced by exercise better than stress to your heart induced by stress? I think, and there were a lot of really interesting comments in there.
One of the things I heard is that like obesity tends to be associated with places in your brain.
Sure.
And just because it has more to do with behavior than with other aspects of your genome. Mm-hmm. but just the complexity of people is sort of very hard to pin down just by looking at the genome alone.
Sure.
Now there are other things like epigenetics, which is like how certain chemicals modify your genome. And relate to the expression levels and how much of a certain gene creates proteins and stuff like that. And there are some interesting findings there too. And if we can use all the information we have, think about why exactly, like, what are the biological pathways that are causing us to be the way that we are, and take sort of all that information, then hopefully one day we'll be able to make better predictions about the way that people's health is going to affect their lives.
Sure.
And that's sort of why I got into it, because I think it's important to understand, how people can be healthy and what we can do to improve human health.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a noble cause.
It's worth my time. It keeps me off the streets.
All right. Well, hey, cool. I really appreciate it. Shoot me an email, I guess, if there's anything else you want to contribute or talk about. And I'll let you know if I have anything else. What's up?
Okay. Do I owe you something? Like, was I going to find something for you? I don't remember. I'll listen back to this and see if there's something that I missed.
Yeah, I think I just had questions on the twin study thing.
Yeah, I mean, you want to know about intelligence and twin studies, and I don't have any background in that. But
yeah.
If you send me what you think the relevant articles are, I can look at them, and I can look at some other things, and I can get back to you about that if you are interested.
Yeah, sure thing.
Yeah, cool.
All right, cool. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Yeah, have a good night.
Yeah, you too.